everyone, and welcome to another episode of Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast. My name is Benjamin Blake Speed Watkins, and I'll be your host today. Today, we're joined by a very special guest. Professor Paul Russell has joined us to discuss Hume. Professor Russell, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here.
So for those of our audience members who are not familiar with your work, could you briefly introduce yourself to the audience, who you are, what you do, and when you first started to get interested in studying philosophy?
Sure. I describe myself now as semi-retired. I taught at the University of British Columbia for about 35 years. I was a professor of philosophy there. And I've still got a job in Sweden at the University of Lund University, where I direct a project on moral responsibility there. So it's not Hume stuff there. It's a sort of related, but a different project over there. My background really, then, by way of getting into Hume it goes all the way back to my PhD thesis at Cambridge. I mean, really, I don't know how much psychoanalysis we have time for here, but it goes all the way back to probably my Scottish roots. And I was certainly an undergraduate at Edinburgh and studied at what was then, if you've been following some of the stuff that's been going on, what was then called the Hume Tower, no longer called the Hume Tower for all kinds of reasons. And that goes back to the 1970s, and we got a lot of Hume when I was an undergraduate, and I guess I absorbed that more than I thought. And I hadn't really planned to do my PhD work on that. I had been working in the philosophy of history, actually. But I found that as I was doing some of the moral responsibility and problems of history, but I swept into doing stuff on Hume, starting off really Hume on free will and moral responsibility. And then I got involved in some of the stuff that we're talking about today, Hume on religion, because I started to realize how much that's central to Hume's philosophy. So this really goes back to my stages as a graduate student, I guess, way back in the early 1980s now. I hate to think about how many decades we're talking about, but 4 of them. And so I've carried on, and that's always been a central interest of mine, and combined with the free will stuff, which I combined with my interest in Hume as well.
Excellent. So David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion obviously take us deep into the philosophy of religion. And one of the questions that we really like to ask people that we interview who have done work in the philosophy of religion is, why should we care about philosophy of religion? So it's kind of a big question, but answers often vary, but I definitely like to see fresh takes on it.
Yeah, it is a big question. It's a good question. I'm sometimes surprised, to be honest. I can see why you ask it, because some people think it's really just kind of a study of dead superstition or something of that sort. But I don't have that, especially people maybe who are not theistically inclined. I would assume that if you're theistically inclined, then it's going to be of central interest to you about the role of the foundations of religion and the relevance of reason and faith and how that all works. So in some ways, I think that, if I could put it this way, that isn't such a difficult question for someone who's theistically inclined. But as you'll see, I'm not. I'm kind of a Hume person that way. I guess that's why I'm here. But for those of us who are not theistically inclined, there might be a thought of, well, why should we take all this, depending just how cavalier you are, why should we take all this crazy stuff so seriously? And I think there are several aspects to that. One is because, at one level, because it matters so much in the world, because so many people who we live with and talk to and have to discuss with and have to make sense of the world with are theistically inclined. So we want to be able to understand, I think, what their view is, what kinds of arguments are there for the position that they take. That's partly an aspect of respecting other people and respecting other views. And of course, some views are more interesting and more sensible than others. Some are pretty hard to make sense of at all. But I mean, even that takes some kind of philosophical effort just to identify what's silly from what's serious. And the practical importance of religion is pretty self-evident. We live in a world in which religion, right now, the contemporary situation, just to take the Gaza as an example, is driven by religious problems of all kinds. So there's that dimension of it. And then I think probably for me, fundamentally, there's a little bit of everybody's biography will be slightly different, but I certainly come from, in my family, religion was taken seriously in my background, my parents' background. I wasn't raised by them as a religious person, but they were raised as very religious people, and all my grandparents were very religious. So I think there's partly a personal biographical aspect, understanding your own family history, your own background. But even beyond that, more generally, I think there's the philosophical challenge of making sense of the world. And for me, certainly, the questions about religion and theism and all the aspects of religion in society, in a broader sense, are of fundamental importance and worth philosophical time and effort.
So we're going to talk about the dialogues concerning natural religion, which are Hume's most mature thoughts regarding big questions in the philosophy of religion, but he draws very heavily on previous works like his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding and his Treatise of Human Nature. Now, you've written a book called Hume's Riddle of the Riddle of Hume's Treatise. I'm sorry, excuse me there.
Yeah.
And the idea in the treatise is that there's two really broad themes. That there's a theme of skepticism and a theme of naturalism. Can you explain to us a little bit of how those two themes give rise to what you call the riddle of Hume's treatise?
Yeah. So yeah, for me, this is very important because there's been a view that was widely held for a long time. Certainly, when I was an undergraduate, I was saying back in the day, and I think still a lot of people, perhaps naively, hold on to it, which is that the treatise isn't really concerned with religion at all. As you say, the usual view is Hume's more sophisticated thoughts starts up in the first inquiry in 1748. He talks about issues of miracles and the design argument there, and you start to see some of his views on religion. He applies some of his empiricist skeptical philosophy later on to problems of religion, and then it really develops in the dialogues and the natural history of religion later on. But as I started to work on Hume's treatise, and I had other interests in it, it became clear to me that there was a very strong religious element. And as you say, Ben, the two components that have always puzzled people is there's a very strong skeptical aspect to the treatise where he seems to argue for a kind of Pyrrhonian extreme skepticism, which almost suggests that our whole common sense worldview is brought into doubt, and even the foundations of science. So as it were, it seems to undermine, seems to be sawing off the branch he's sitting on, in the sense that he also seems to be pursuing a science of man, which is supposed to give us a kind of scientific understanding of human nature and human morals and society. So how can these two components fit together? And that's been a long-standing puzzle in Hume's scholarship for people who are interested in that. In the early 20th century, late 19th century, the skeptical view dominated. People just took, oh, Hume's a kind of extreme radical skeptic. He's kind of using empiricist principles to undermine all human knowledge, and including morality and religion and everything, but not just morality and religion. But then in the 20th century, there were various people. The figure who's most associated with this is a Scottish philosopher, Norman Kemp Smith, who sort of said, well, there's this constructive side in Hume, the science of man, and the importance of feeling, the limits of skepticism, and the emphasizing that aspect. But it's always been a puzzle how these two really fit together. And the gist of my view is this is the riddle that you described. And as you said, Ben, the fundamental solution to that is, once you realize that Hume is really concerned with religion, just to package it in a slightly simple way, but the skeptical side is a response to, and the naturalist side actually, in my view, fit together quite neatly. And it goes back to Thomas Hobbes, for those of your readers, your listeners who know Thomas Hobbes. And the idea here is that you have a secular science of human nature and human morals, morals understood in terms of the foundations in human nature. And then you also, but this really, as it were, threatens a Christian worldview about both philosophy and morality. And you need a skeptical philosophy to undermine the theological natural religion and morals. So Hume's, in a nutshell, Hume's skeptical arguments are very much directed towards Christian theology, both in terms of metaphysics and morals, to make room for his secular scientific account of human nature and human morality.
So you've mentioned one very influential Hume scholar here, Norman Kemp Smith. Another very influential Hume scholar in this area is J.C.A. Gaskins. And because he's given an interpretation of Hume and sees him as, I think he would largely agree with you that Hume's not this total skeptic, but more of this kind of mitigated Pyrrhonian skeptic. But he would say that Hume, because there's a big question about, where does Hume fall on this question of God's existence? Is he an atheist? Is he an agnostic? Is he a theist? What are actually Hume's views in the end? And, there's obviously some controversy about that, but Gaskins would say that Hume was kind of this attenuated deist. So kind of this very, very thin, religiously insignificant type deist. Do you see that as being a pushback on your interpretation of Hume in the treatise, or do you think that that's compatible with your solution to the riddle of Hume's treatise?
Well, that's an interesting question. And there's certainly a level at which, you're quite right, Gaskin sees Hume as what he describes as this attenuated deist or minimalist theist of some sort. So in terms of orthodox views, you might say, I think Gaskin in effect says, really from the orthodox point of view, Hume's tantamount to an atheist. He doesn't believe in anything like an orthodox Christian conception of God. So if I can put it in terms of my kind of language, this is maybe not Gaskin's language, but I would say there's a kind of, Gaskin certainly sees a strong irreligious element in Hume's philosophy, and we're totally agreed about that. And Gaskin, in some ways, I think, and I think I agree with that. My view and his views converge in the sense that there was another view, which was that Hume was just a skeptic, and he was neither a theist or an atheist, and that both the theist and the atheist had to be dogmatic philosophers of some sort. And on this skeptical view, Hume was just a kind of agnostic who wasn't a theist or an atheist. He didn't take any opinion. He just thought it was all beyond human understanding. Gaskin's view, as you say, Ben, is really leans more towards what I would describe as the irreligious view, which is that he is really, he has a harder skeptical position, more hostile to religion than that all the way through. And this isn't just about the theism issue, but about miracles, about religion and morality, about the role of the church and the clergy. It goes quite deep, and you might say, if you want, it's a kind of anti-Christian agenda. And I think so all the way up to that, Gaskin and I are pretty well on those fundamentals, we're in agreement, although particular things might vary. Where there is a kind of point of departure is, so we're kind of, I would say we're both kind of on the irreligious view about Hume, that Hume's clearly irreligious, and not everybody does accept that. There's still some resistance to that in some quarters. But where, and Gaskin, as you said quite rightly, has this kind of very minimalist view, which basically says religion, his theistic view is so thin and so minimalist that it has no practical significance at all. So if you want, it's almost like practically speaking, it's like an atheism, because it doesn't have any kind of real functional operation in our life and morality and how we live. But I actually do disagree, I think, with the Gaskin view about whether or not Hume is an atheist. I somewhat moved myself in that when I wrote the riddle that you were referring to a minute ago. My view is that Hume was very much an atheist with respect to what I would call a thicker or more robust conception of God, if you want a more orthodox conception that had the full kind of fleet of essential attributes, and that maybe Hume was more of a kind of agnostic about the minimalist conception, and that would bring me closer to something like a Gaskin view. But I think I don't know if this is being grumpy old guy that I get more and more strong in my views myself, but I increasingly think that actually Hume was more even was certainly had stronger skeptical views about even minimal theism of that sort, and that Hume actually was hostile to those views himself. But Hume didn't place a lot of concern about that, because what he was more concerned about was a convergence on the kind of irreligious agenda, at the more orthodox level. That was where Hume was really concerned. So
he saw himself as kind of combating superstition in a way. He wanted to use the resources that were available in philosophies, which he, very much was upfront, that are very narrow. The limits of human reason are narrow, but those even within those narrow limits, we can battle superstition.
Yes, we can undermine it, and is particularly, I think, as I read Hume, particularly Hume does make a difference between the kinds of religion we're talking about and the kinds of forms of theism, some of which he sees as much more dangerous and corrupting and pernicious than others. So he's not just a kind of blanket, I don't believe in religion kind of stance. He thinks, as you say, that superstition of certain problematic kinds, it's both, from one point of view, philosophically and scientifically ignorant, and from another point of view, morally corrupt and corrupting. It's those kinds that he's especially concerned with. And that gives him common cause with people who might be thin theists or even just skeptics, because they're all on the same track to fight superstition. Having said that, I still think that for Hume it matters there are still real issues about whether you're just a skeptic or whether you're a thin theist, or whether, as I read Hume, he's actually just a flat-out atheist.
So Hume is often seen as kind of a lot of writers will say that Hume has dealt something of a death blow to the argument from design. And so I kind of wanted to take this opportunity to transition to the design argument that's presented in the dialogues concerning natural religion, because really the design argument, I think it would be fair to say, is the bulk of what gets discussed in those dialogues. Now, obviously, there are other things that are discussed. Hume kind of lays out his mitigated skepticism. He talks about the cosmological argument, and we'll see, he also talks about the problem of evil and other things. But really, the meat of the discussion is the argument from design. But now this is also a view that's not universally accepted, because a lot of people say that, no, it was really Darwin and his On the Origin of Species that dealt the death blow to the design argument, and that Hume didn't really have the resources to raise the objections needed to the design argument. Now, I don't buy that line of reasoning, and I suspect that you don't really either. Why do you think that Hume's criticisms of the design argument are so important to really the history of that time period, as far as what the philosophy of religion looked like at the time? Because this was, at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, really the kind of the leading argument in natural theology.
No, I know. I recognize what you're talking about when you talk about these. There are people like contemporary, people who are actually on board, if you want, kind of on the atheistic side of, or heavily skeptical atheistic side of things, like Elliot Sober, I think, and Richard Dawkins both say that Hume really wasn't able to deliver that knockout blow, and it was, as you say, it was they say it was Darwin, because I guess part is the grounding of that claim about Hume's not being his impact being limited was that he, as they see it, he didn't really have an alternative thesis to explain the order, harmony, seeming superficial signs of design that we look at, and he had no real theory or alternative other than chance. or
Like a
randomness.
uniform chance, like just like blind chance with
Yeah, some kind of crazy Epicurean world in which there's just sort of
infinite cycles of finite matter springing
yeah.
into order over time. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think it's Elliot Sober though who uses something an example of something like a tornado blowing through a junkyard and then sort of
Yeah.
order appearing out of that, and how improbable that seems. So that's one claim that they make, and that Hume really didn't have an alternative hypothesis. And I want to come back to that, but even on that, though, my view is that what Hume did an extremely good job of, even if you were to just accept that, and I don't actually, as I'll explain, Hume still showed the kind of extreme limitations and weaknesses of the theist hypothesis and how limited it was as a way of responding to the kinds of features of the world that puzzle us and that we want to try and make sense of. Order, harmony, final causes, things of that sort. And so I still think Hume is, from any point of view, is profoundly important if you want just on the negative side, and that he, even if he didn't have an alternative hypothesis, he did a very good job of showing the problems with the theistic efforts, especially of a more orthodox kind, to justify their position on that basis. But in terms of his alternative, it's, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, he has what he calls the Epicurean hypothesis, which isn't just, I think this is in sections, I think this is
it's either 6 or 7. I can look it up.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I'd have to check that myself, but he has, I guess it's sort of in, 7, you're right. And 8 to some extent. He's got this Epicurean hypothesis where he is saying that there's some kind of order that might be sort of inherent in the material world itself. And he sort of has a proto-Darwinian, I think this has been widely recognized, a lot of people have commented on it, theory about how order might establish itself in a system that's just, as it were, blind in these ways, has no intelligence behind it or creating it or ordering it, but that it would establish itself in ways that there was standing order and structure, and that those structures would start to maintain themselves. And you get something like a proto-version of a kind of Darwinian natural selection going on. And you've got a kind of very crude version of it, but at least there's something other than just plain chance going on there on that Humean Epicurean.
It's a mindless chance process. There's things going on, because I think he uses the analogies with generation and vegetation, and so he imagines that these are just these universes that can copulate somehow and give birth, or they can germinate and then sprout a seed that then goes into it eventually decays and then sprouts into another universe. And so these are just what Hume is describing. To my reading of it is, this is almost really an abductive way of looking at it. It's saying that, look, if we compare these two hypotheses, this Epicurean hypothesis does better than the theistic hypothesis. We still don't really have that much reason to accept that hypothesis, but so much the worse for theism.
Exactly. And as you say, that again, there's another big debate about the inductive. Hume's argument is generally presented in terms of an inductive form based on experience and repetition and analogy. But there's this abductive side, which is sort of a different structure. That itself, as you know, has become a big debate in the contemporary literature. And I quite agree. And, as you probably know, and some of my own work has been to just show that you can take some of the material that Hume gives, even though he's not self-conscious about these distinctions, and apply it to this contemporary debate. And you get this kind of thing. And as you say, really, with these alternative analogies and alternative hypotheses that Hume comes up with, they're ones that don't depend on theist hypothesis at all, but they seem equally well grounded, if you want, no more improbable than all the other ones, right? So he says they're all equally kind of radically way beyond our ken, but the ones that he comes up with aren't just chance. They're alternative hypotheses about the order that might be inherent in nature itself, and that we can make some sense of that. And of course, it is absolutely true that the Darwinian hypothesis itself moves us much further down the track of making sense of some of this in terms of natural selection and complexity. But Hume really anticipates it in quite important ways.
I thought you made a really, really good point in one of your papers. I'm trying to remember which one it was now. But when you were discussing this, you pointed out that Hume doesn't formulate the design argument in an abductive form. But now in the problem of evil, he gives an evidential argument from evil in an abductive form. So it's not like that this form was alien to him in some way. He chose not to put an abductive argument in there because there's no way to justify the divine psychology we have to attribute to God in order to get it to confer a probability on an observation of order. We have no idea what a God would, what sort of order a God would want to prefer. And I thought that was a really good insight because Hume does give at least two design arguments. You mentioned one, this kind of enumerative induction, where you count the number of things, and then you see how close the analogy is to human design. But he also gives one where, he's like, look, you just look at something ordered and it just strikes you as something designed. There's an example, I'm trying to think of the name of it in the literature, but like there's a scientist and he's in a Nazi manufacturing warehouse. And so there's all these parts around him and he doesn't speak German. So he doesn't know what any of these things are, but he knows they had a designer because it just overwhelmingly strikes him as something designed. And Pele makes this point with you find a watch on a heath and it just strikes you.
There's got to be some intelligence behind this.
Yeah, so to me it seems like Hume saw strength in that design argument. It's just a natural belief to see it as something to design, and then the analogy inductive version, but then he just didn't see any strength in the abductive one, and so he just left that out. And I don't think I saw that until I read your paper, and I was like, oh yeah, he's obviously aware of this form of argument, but he very clearly doesn't use it. He doesn't put that in the mouth of any of his characters.
The main line, certainly as I read Hume, the main line of his argument is a kind of concern about the weakness of the analogy. Yeah. That the design argument seems to rest on. There are sort of as you know, technical difficulties here, but the idea of the inductive argument is it's supposed to give us reason to believe that there exists a God, not just that it's a good theory, but that there's actually something that's there, and that our evidence and experience of the world is such that we really can make a sort of rational inference to the existence of an intelligent being that bears some remote analogy or some close analogy to the human mind. So it's supposed to deliver something like probability and truth to us. So that's, as it were, the strength of the inductive argument is that our experience supports this and that we can draw some rational evidence. And I guess, as you were saying about the dialogues, there are other kinds of arguments that he considers, mainly the cosmological argument. But the great advantages of the design argument is that it just appeals so much to common, ordinary people that, gosh, we just look at the world and it's ordered and structured in these ways. So it seems like it's a very simple, if I can put it this way, a very simple and attractive argument. As you said, we see watches and you assume somebody made it. You see a complicated machine. I've got no idea. Somebody had a power washer on their driveway the other day, and I said to them, what on earth is that for? And he said to me, he wasn't impressed by my lack of practical know-how, but he said, well, that's a power washer. You don't even know that. He was shocked. But I thought it does something. It's made by somebody. I had this kind of natural reaction. And then we're supposed to have the same, basically, as you said, sort of natural response to our experience of the world to say, this can't just be kind of random chaos. This is a kind of fundamental theistic response. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because just to come back to that, there's a big debate about whether or not Hume thought that theism of some sort like that is a natural belief. He certainly thought there was a natural propensity or liability to an inference of that sort. But Hume actually does stop short of thinking of it as a strong natural belief in the way he thinks there are some other natural beliefs that we have, like our natural belief in the existence of the material world.
Hence, it many more sound arguments like that. There might be many more sound arguments of natural beliefs that strike us that are stronger
Yeah,
than that religious one.
yeah, and that's so. Isn't he? What he thinks is that he even thinks that something as minimal as just a belief in intelligent, invisible powers in the world isn't absolutely universal. And then when he talks about genuine theism, he thinks you need to believe in something more than just intelligent, invisible powers. You need to believe that there's an intelligent, invisible power that's the original cause of the world. And he certainly doesn't think that's a universal belief. I just say this by way to mitigate the idea that Hume thinks that this it's the argument sometimes from universal consent that everybody believes this. Hume tries to dampen down on that, and I'm sympathetic to that. But having said that, at the same time, he is also aware of, and if you want, concedes that there's a propensity to look at that order and beauty and harmony in the world and seeming ends and means fitted to one another. And he does think that this does lead to this irregular argument, a kind of spontaneous belief or hypothesis of theism. And that looks a bit like an abductive argument, just a kind of, it's not inductive, as you say, it's abductive. And then he brings out that even that argument has all kinds of, even the abductive version has all kinds of problems itself. And I agree with you that that's all there, although as is very typical of Hume, he kind of nuances it all the way through.
One of my favorite parts of the dialogue comes in part 4. So in parts 2 and 3, we kind of get the basics of the design argument, and Philo lays out some kind of preliminary objections to it. But then what Hume does that I think is just absolutely brilliant is that he pits Cleanthes against Demea. And so that these are just two models of God. So for the viewers that might be unfamiliar, Cleanthes is the paradigmatic empirical theist, natural theologian who's trying to use inductive methods to get to God. But he's also what Hume calls an anthropomorphic model, an anthropomorphism. So he sees an analogy with the divine as being human-like. So Hume has this famous, it's called the copy principle. So how do we have this idea of God? Well, it's because we've had the idea of intelligence copied. And so that's where we get the idea for the divine. Well, Demea is on the other side of this. So he's more of the rationalist, a priori thinker who's trying to use deductive methods to get to certainty, but he has a mystical model of God. So the idea of God's mind is incomprehensible to us. Like there's basically he's outlining Aquinas. You know, he's like, this being is wholly simple and wholly immutable and just totally beyond human comprehension. How do you see Hume setting those two against each other? I'm interested here because I find that whole thing just incredible.
Well, I agree with you. It's kind of the beautiful model of behind the whole dialogue structure, you know, with Philo as the skeptic. And it's a skeptical strategy to play off dogmatists against one another, or people their opponents against one another with their own arguments. And you can see that going on. So there's a tendency for the defenders of the argument a priori, the cosmological argument, to have criticisms of their colleagues who are defending the argument from design or a posteriori, and then and vice versa. So you just play them off against one another, and you end up kind of collapsing them both with their own arguments.
So Hume even makes the point. They're calling each other atheists. And
yes.
So what does this do to the argument from universal consent that we just talked about?
Yeah.
You know, hence it is like they're just destroying that argument.
Yeah. I mean, I see it in one of the papers that you referred to, the paper on Hume's skepticism and the problem of atheism. I call this the Philo's dilemma. And there is kind of a dilemma that he's posing with these two characters, which is, if you really think that the experimental method and approach is viable, and certainly Hume thinks that the only viable form of theism, rational theology, is the experimental method, or this, the argument from design, because he has his own objections to the cosmological argument. And a priori reasoning is being unconvincing. But with the argument of design, if you really go the route of Cleanthes, as you're saying, if you go that route, Hume sort of says that in effect, well, you end up with this anthropomorphized and quite implausible conception, because you really can't justify the various attributes.
We make ourselves
ourselves a model of the universe, exactly. And, you know, does God get angry, and does God love us, all this kind of stuff, and does God have serial thoughts, all these problems that
Is he corporal? Does he have like an eyes and a nose?
Yeah, why not give him a body? All this stuff. And Hume actually has fun with it, which is why I always laugh when people say, oh, he's really a kind of agnostic, because he certainly has very kind of cheeky, skeptical things to say about anthropomorphized conceptions of God that are, to my mind, pretty amusing, but and probably in this context, pretty dangerous to be joking about. But the flip side of that, on the one side, you've got the dynamic, as you say, with Cleanthes going in that route, and you go down the anthropomorphic side. If it's reasonable to make these conjectures, then you end up with an overly anthropomorphized and implausible conception. But then Demius says, oh, we shouldn't go that way. We should be more sort of circumspect in our conjectures and the kinds of attributes. But then you end up with a kind of total mysterious nature of God that's incomprehensible, and you're just back on a kind of radical skepticism, which, as Hume says, is in effect tantamount to a real atheism, because you don't believe in anything. And if I can just use this, Ben, to make a point that I think is often missed in the literature about Hume, is that Hume has his own theory of belief here. You know, and there's a question about what Hume can believe in and what Hume does believe in. And one of the interesting points that he makes is that belief is vulnerable to certain, when we make inferences that we believe in something, like, so if we see the watch, we believe it had an intelligent maker of some kind, so we make an inference on the basis of our experience. This depends, as Hume says, on several things, like the strength of the analogy, whether there are other hypotheses that are available to us, and how clear or vague an idea we have of the object we're making the inference to. In the case of thin theism in particular, it's rather interesting, and I think this is part of Hume's concern about the nature of our belief in God. In the case of thin or minimal theism, we've got a particularly vague conception. This is the problem the mystics have. And for Hume, we don't really have an object of knowledge or belief at all. We don't even know what we believe in. So for Hume, this becomes a huge problem. It's very hard on Hume's theory of belief to make sense of how people even believe in anything. He makes the same claim about a future state. He says, people say they believe in a future state. This goes all the way back to the treatise. And Hume says, nobody sincerely believes in the future state, because they don't even have an idea of what it is they're supposedly believing in.
Hume is really brilliant in this respect, in the sense that he's really showing us the limits of what human reason can attain. And so he said, because at many points he concedes this mystical model of God, but then asks question, like, of what concern is it to our lives? Is this a being that's going to answer our prayers, is going to defeat evil in the end, is going to offer us salvation for our sins, is going to, things like, this is what people, as far as natural religion go, this is what they want. Yes, they want that part of their religion to be founded on reason and evidence. And Hume is basically showing you in pretty clear terms, I think, like, you're just not going to get there. That's not how that's not how we are as rational animals.
Right.
So
that's exactly right. That dynamic is, in fact, in the natural history of religion, he kind of runs through that, doesn't he? There's a version of this in the natural history of religion as well. He runs through, we want this anthropomorphized, if you want, figure who can help allay our fears and our anxieties and serve our hopes and expectations. But when we try to lean it on reason, we get a thinner and thinner version then doesn't serve those purposes, and then we go back to the anthropomorphized version because we need that.
And it's very easy for someone who is sympathetic with religion to slide back and forth between these models without even really kind of realizing it. They'll say things like, well, God designed X for a reason Y, but then also say, but God's ways are not our ways. We have no idea why he would do it.
Exactly.
And him saying, like, you can't have it both ways.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. This kind of Job would be the classic example with the difficulties of evil. You just end up falling between two stools, really.
Yeah. So after Hume kind of pits Cleanthes and Demea against each other, that's when Philo really starts to come in and kind of hammer it home. So one of the first really big objections is that there's this assumption that order is not intrinsic to the world, but order is intrinsic to mind. So a universe of material objects stands in need of explanation, whereas a universe of mental ideas doesn't require that. And Hume says, no, that's not right. A universe of mental ideas requires a cause just as much as order in material objects. Yes. And so it's just a prejudice to say that mind can just fall into order of itself, but material can't.
Right.
Do you think that objection still holds water today? Do you think that's still relevant because the design argument is still alive and well, but how would a theist even go about responding to the charge that the order of God's mind requires a cause just as much as material objects do?
Yeah, this is like a problem, a kind of infinite regress problem, which is, and why should you just have an arbitrary stop? If you find that the world is demanding explanation, then you need to have some kind of explanation for God and the order of God's mind. And we just go from one level of mystery to another, and we start free falling. I can't remember, Hugh used the example of the Indian myth of the elephant standing on the tortoise and all of that. I think that's in Locke as well. And there is some kind of worry about the kind of explanations have to stop somewhere, and how far down do we go, and can we ever reach, as it were, some ultimate explanation? And what are we looking for when we look for some ultimate explanation? It's kind of interesting because some other problems, like the free will problem, have kind of versions of this appear as well, infinite regress problems of a sort. And I agree that there is a kind of, one clever move that Hume makes is why the arbitrary accepting that the mental world doesn't need any kind of ultimate explanation, but we demand it for the material world. Why the asymmetry there? It just looks like an arbitrary prejudice. That itself makes a point, but it raises, doesn't it, Ben? I think one of the things that I think for whether you're a theist or an atheist, there's always the question about the puzzle of brute existence and the fact of brute existence. And one of the things I think I respect about Hume is that there is the sense that although he's deeply dissatisfied with the theistic response, and I think he basically does a pretty good job of undermining orthodox views all the way through, he retains a respect for the puzzle and the difficulty about brute existence and how we can explain it and how we respond to it. So if you get down to this question of looking for ultimate explanations, you might just say it's a brute fact that we exist. This comes a little bit, this is where, if you want, the design argument might meet up with the cosmological argument to some extent. Why anything exists at all? What kind of explanation are we looking for? And there is a kind of deep need to have, as it were, rational explanation that somehow is self-supporting at the foundation. The way some great theists try to explain this, people like Samuel Clarke try to talk about God as a necessarily existent being, but it's still not clear what that actually, well, one of the points Hume makes is not even clear what that means. And it really isn't, it just replaces one kind of mystery with another in effect. So the crucial the crucial thing here is that we still need some kind of, we still are faced with, if you want, on the atheistic view, the fact that you're discrediting some arguments like the theist hypothesis, and you're saying that there are other possible hypotheses, but they raise their own problem with kind of brute existence. Why is there this kind of brute existence? What sense, and how much can we expect to know about it? Now, this is where as I read Hume, the skeptic comes in, which is there's just a limit to what we can know. But obviously with this is where contemporary science comes in, and this is beyond my area of expertise, but there will be kind of efforts to find kind of theories, cosmological theories, that might help us push the boundaries of our ignorance about why things exist the way they do, and whether they have to be the way they are, and what sort of possibilities there were. But these are questions that require not just kind of crazy theistic hypotheses, but something much more satisfactory than that are more intelligible.
Something more proportioned to the evidence.
More proportioned to the evidence, and more credible theories behind them. Yes. So they might be more satisfactory, even if they don't fundamentally get rid of that, as you say, the ultimate mystery of existence itself.
One of the things in the beginning of the dialogues that Hume sets up between Philo and Cleanthes is really Hume lays out his mitigated skepticism. And the way I read it becomes very relevant to this next part of the discussion for the design argument, is that Hume thinks that when we look at reason itself, it sort of furnishes itself with invincible arguments to skepticism. So he has Sextus Empiricus in mind, this idea that we can't prove anything. Either proofs go all the way down, they're circular, or they're just dogmas. And so he thinks that the only way to beat skepticism is to just return into our everyday experience. When we're living our normal lives, that's when that sort of skepticism doesn't have any hold on us. It's when we go beyond our experience that then those skeptical concerns come roaring back. And so now when we metaphysically speculate, those metaphysical speculations are on a par with the full force of those skeptical arguments. And so what I get from this is that abstruse metaphysical speculations license abstruse metaphysical rejoinders. So if you can go out, if you can put all these wild speculations on the table, like an immaterial mind is the creator, well, Hume has the same license to go beyond experience and say that, no, it's actually a vegetating something. It's a generating something. And that these wild speculations are on the same par with that theistic.
No more incredible.
Yeah, exactly. And so he starts to, in this next part of the dialogues, he starts that all parties can see that there's differences in the analogies. But Hume starts to point to really important differences, that like minds always have bodies. Points like that, things like we've seen reason beings come from generation, but we've never seen something like generation come from reason. Yes. And so these are ways in which the scales, granted we're working with these abstruse metaphysical speculations, but it seems that the scales tip them in favor of those generation and vegetation hypotheses instead of the theistic hypothesis. Do you see Hume's strategy there more or less that way of trying to say, look, we don't have any, the evidence supports them all. Yeah. We don't have no observation is going to settle this. So we should just suspend judgment like a good Pyrrhonian.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's an interesting question. The Pyrrhonian is, as I read, the Pyrrhonian is an extreme skeptic, and then there's a mitigated skeptic who, and the way I read Hume, because there is a question about how Hume's skepticism is supposed to be consistent with his atheism, if he is an atheism, and some people see that as a kind of problem. And an extreme skeptic doesn't, as you said, and this comes up right in the opening section of the dialogues, is Cleanthes plays with this, which is nobody takes the extreme skeptic seriously. They don't believe in anything. They are kind of erode all human knowledge, and you start off saying that you don't believe in God, and then we end up, you don't believe in anything. You don't believe in science. You don't even know whether the sun will rise tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So, and Hume, I certainly, it's a big question in Hume scholarship how much he remains committed to that form of extreme skepticism. But I read Hume as saying nobody really can live the life of an extreme skeptic, and it's not plausible. In fact, Hume in the dialogues, I think Philo makes remarks to this effect. But there is a mitigated skeptic. So the mitigated skeptic is the one, there are two principles that really guide that. One is that nobody should be a dogmatist. We should always be aware of our fallibility and our the fact that that certainty eludes us even in things that we think we're most confident about. So there's a kind of anti-dogmatic message that's in the mitigated skepticism, and that runs all the way through human knowledge, not just in relation to theology. But there's a second part, which is that if you're really a mitigated skeptic, you don't have to be an extreme skeptic, but the mitigated skeptic says when we're aware of the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities and the limitations of human reason, we won't be making conjectures beyond the scope of human experience and human understanding. So we will confine our speculations to just ordinary common life. And so in a way that kind of leads to the skeptical view of Hume, that he's just this kind of agnostic who says, let's not get involved in any speculations of any sort at all. But the issue here a little bit is that Hume does say, nevertheless, if you go down the track with Cleanthes and say, well, let's allow that human experience and human knowledge allows us to make some conjectures about issues about the origins of the world or a future state, the two eternities. And we allow that human understanding can at least have some narrow comprehension of these issues based on our experience, our confined experience of this world and this life. You still have some, and you alluded to this, Ben, it's something that I think is somewhat neglected in a lot of Hume scholarship. There's one argument here that Hume certainly advances, which is we never find minds without being accompanied by bodies. This is part of our experience. And this is in 6 and 8, he talks about this.
Yep.
And this, for me, this is quite an important thing where Hume shows that he is at least willing to, as it were, trade in these arguments based on our experience of this world. As you said, if we're going to be advancing these hypotheses, as the theist like Cleanthes wants to do, and we really are going to rely on evidence, then some hypotheses really just won't stand up at all, because a hypothesis like the theist hypothesis starts right off on the wrong foot by assuming that we have we have no experience of these bodiless minds. So if you're going to give any credibility to this kind of methodological principle of relying on experimental theism, it collapses right at the get-go for Hume. I think for Hume, this on my reading for Hume, this is very important because it goes well beyond his, if you want, concern with robust, thick theism, orthodox theism. It cuts right down to even the most minimalist conception of theism, of the sort, as you said right at the beginning of our discussion about Gaskin. I think Hume's view is that even that just won't stand up to any kind of rational evidence based on our experience, if that's the way we're going.
I think that's exactly right. I'm actually I'm writing a chapter right now to contribute to a debate review, book on a debate review, and it's the argument from physical minds. And so it's basically I'm taking a Humean strategy and saying that, look, when we postulate this mind over and above the natural world, what we're doing is we're making our hypothesis more inconsistent with our background knowledge. And
exactly.
That inconsistency with our background knowledge is not in itself a problem, but it has a cost. There's an evidential cost that whenever you make your final judgment on the total evidence, you have to have accounted for that somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you're relying on it when you think it's favorable. You can't dispense of it when you think it's unfavorable. So that just seems a totally arbitrary and irrational, unjustified step.
And I think it also puts a lot of pressure on a theist in the sense of disagreements about prior probability. So if it turns out that there are unembodied minds or purely immaterial minds in the world, and that was part of our background knowledge, then that could pretty well alleviate this objection. But insofar as our experience is uniform, that minds are constantly conjoined with bodies,
right?
The prior probability is favoring the naturalist in this case.
Right, exactly, because even as you say, if abductively there's something to be said for the likelihood of the theist hypothesis, the prior probability of the hypothesis almost collapses. That, I think that's an important point. And as you said, again, referring back to our earlier discussion, for Hume, this is all tied up a little bit in his inductive argument, but there's a kind of quite easy way of transitioning into the abductive argument to talk about prior probabilities of the theist hypothesis in these terms.
So this might be a good time to transition into, because, well, so after the design argument, there's one chapter, section 9, on the cosmological argument. But then in section 10, he opens up into the argument from evil. And so he doesn't give one argument from evil, he gives two. Why do you think he gives two?
Again, interesting problem. And, it's part of, as you were saying about Hume, I think for those of us who read Hume and enjoy him, you just see how clever he is, because it's a bit like a really clever legal argument. You give a strong argument that people might push back on, but it still leaves you with the weak argument, and all you need is the weak argument. So the strategy, as I see it, Ben, is a bit, and you probably see this too, is he's got this argument for the incompatibility of evil with God's moral attributes. So that's if you want the kind of slightly putting it slightly naively, that if there was an all-powerful, benevolent, all-good God, why? But this is the fundamental Epicurean challenge. Why any evil in the world? So we can't have if there's any real evil in the world, then we don't have reason to believe in a God with the moral attributes.
That's just a matter of logic.
Yeah, just straight contradiction. So there's an incompatibility there. But then Hume retreats from that, and he says, okay, so maybe there's some kind of theodicy where you're going to try and explain that they're all necessary evils, or they're not real evils, or some version of that. Now, Hume actually has kickback on both of those, and I think reasons for actually doubting them. And he, interestingly, never really retreats from that strong incompatibility argument. But he says, I can concede that and retreat to it. All I have to say, though, is something far more weak, which is that the inference you're wanting to make on the basis of our experience of this world, you have to vindicate the moral attributes of the divine nature. And given that we have mixed phenomenon that's not purely good, and and then Hume, as you know, in 10 especially, it's a mix for kind of dreary reading. He just catalogs all the miseries of human life. We have a surplus of problems here. And really, all Hume needs, I've always been impressed by this, all he needs is just one case of arbitrary, meaningless, pointless evil to vindicate the claim that there can't possibly be a God that's both omnipotent and perfectly benevolent and good. So you just need the thinnest reed to discredit the theist hypothesis and the inference for it. Just very, very weak. And so Hume really leaves that challenge right out for the theist to try and deal with. So he doesn't need the really strong incompatibility or contradiction problem. He just needs to point out we have an abundance of evil in this world, and maybe there's some reason why it's necessary, and we don't understand it because we're too weak and finite and so on and so forth. But we have absolutely no reason, contrary to the theist, to infer divine moral perfection on the basis of our super limited understanding of this world and all the contrary evidence that we confront. So it's a very clever argument. I think that's why it resonates, that argument in Hume's form, probably one of, certainly for me, it's one that resonates very deeply if you have anything like an orthodox conception of God with the moral attributes. And of course, Cleanthes does. So even if you vindicate some kind of divine being of some kind of intelligent designer, if you can't vindicate the moral attributes, you really are in trouble from an orthodox theist perspective.
Like you said earlier, like it was really kind of like a brilliant legal argument. And I think that's a really good analogy, because he's built up to this argument. And this is where we start to see the abductive form. So he says, look, the world is full of both good and evil. And so he puts four hypotheses on the table, you know, a perfectly good being, a perfectly evil being, both good and evil being, and an indifferent being.
Yeah.
And he says, look, the indifferent hypothesis is obviously the more, the one with the most explanatory power here.
Yes.
But keep in mind that he's built up the design argument. And so now, and he's also talked about the cosmological argument. So when he starts this conversation, Philo is pressing the objection. He concedes to Cleanthes, the universe has both a cause, and that cause is responsible for the order in the universe, but it's indifferent. Yeah. And so we're left right back in that problem that we had with Demea all the way back in section 4, where we're like, this is not a being that's religiously significant. Yeah. Why would we ever think that an indifferent being would respond to our religious concerns, like answering prayers, defeating evil in the end? It's not even defeating evil now.
No. As Woody Allen said, if there's a God, he's an underachiever. I think that's
so to me, to see those layers build throughout the discourse, or through the dialogue, I should say, to me, it's just really a brilliant part of it. And it's even become known today as the gap problem. Yeah. There's that even if we were to concede to the theist the teleological argument, yeah, and a cosmological argument or argument from contingency, we still have the conclusion from the problem of the problem of evil that says
exactly
the most likely cause of all this is indifferent.
Yeah.
And then to me, that kind of really, that's, if you're looking for the knockout blow to the both the teleological and the cosmological argument, you kind of find it here.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's not going to, as you said much earlier, it's not going to deliver what people in any kind of orthodox regime really are looking for. And, you know, Cleanthes himself recognizes this. And I think most, if you want, kind of mainline theists have to, you're really not salvaging much by the time you're through with that. If you give up on that, and it's very hard to resist it.
And we don't have to wait until Darwin.
No.
This
no.
is all.
Exactly. That's right. Because even, as you say, even if we get some kind of intelligent thin being, some incomprehensible being that vaguely is like us, it simply doesn't deliver what we really obviously need here. And we're just left with something totally meaningless, which is in some ways even more problematic than where we started out.
So this brings us to one of the most notorious parts of the dialogues, what Daniel Dennett has called Hume's strange inversion.
Yeah.
And so Hume has spent all of this time and energy and effort to critique the arguments of theism, but specifically the teleological argument. But then he says in the end of the dialogue that he actually is a theist, and that God's mind bears some remote resemblance to human intelligence. And so a lot of people see this as Hume kind of backing away from all of those arguments that he just had, and perhaps is going back to that irregular design argument that just strikes us with such force. Yeah. How do you see Hume's strange inversion?
Yeah, well, this is one of that last section of the dialogue certainly raises puzzles. And, you know, I would preface this, and with something we haven't really talked a lot about because we've been looking in the arguments of the dialogues themselves. But, you know, it has to be remembered that in the context Hume was writing, what he was saying was pretty dangerous stuff. And I think it's really quite odd to me how philosophers sometimes talk as if Hume was just somebody sitting in, you know, your hometown or my hometown right now in Canada, the United States, or Western Europe, where we have religious freedom, hard-fought religious freedom. Hume played a role in that. But Hume and his publishers and anyone dealing with those were, you know, Hume suppressed the dialogues for about 20 years. They were mainly done 20 years, if not 25 years.
1751, I think, is like the differences
Right.
between 1751 to 1779. I mean, are very minor.
3 years after he died, and Adam Smith, all these stories that some of you'll know and that some of your listeners will know about. Even Adam Smith was sort of, I don't want to be involved in the public.
Yeah, he was like, well,
I don't want trouble. It was dangerous stuff. His publishers are all, you know, there was no publisher's name on the dialogues when it was printed. So I preface that in relation to what you asked about Philo's reversal, because Hume's constantly doing this kind of, oh, of course, I'm really quite orthodox. But, you know, by the way, the argument doesn't work. But of course, the argument does work. But no, it doesn't really. So you're doing this, you know. Yeah. But this was even other thinkers like de Holbach, who was contemporary of Hume's and Hume knew, talks about this need for having esoteric communication, to be careful how you present your stuff, your views that are irreligious, if not atheistic, because of course you had to package them in ways that would be acceptable and not plain out dangerous. But even at that, it's interesting. I call it Hume's double reversal, because as you say, Ben, at the beginning of Dialogue 12, he's got this Philo's reversal where he says, oh, of course, even the most stupid mind sees that there's some kind of evidence of design, there must be some intelligence. But then he goes right back to doing a double reversal, which is, instead of saying the analogy is close, he says the exact opposite. He says it's extremely remote. And it finishes with that undefined proposition. I don't have my dialogues in front of me, but the famous undefined proposition, which, if I can remember, runs something like the cause or causes of the universe bear some remote analogy to the human mind. And
that the cause or causes of order in the universe probably bear some remote analogy to human intelligence.
Right.
1233.
Right at the end. And that leaves us, as Gaskin, and this is where Gaskin and I agree, that leaves us with almost nothing. That you certainly don't have anything that Cleanthes cares about from any kind of even this.
Or Demina, much
or Demina, yes, exactly. Almost any, they're all. So there's a facade of making it. I mean, I think on any reading, there's a facade of making a concession, but there's no real concession here at all. And in fact, as I say, as I read Hume, for reasons that he says that to the extent that there is some kind of human mind, it's still a hypothesis that Hume thinks is totally unbelievable. And in fact, the psychology of Hume's belief is such that Hume certainly can't believe in it. And he doesn't think anybody who actually ends up with such a minimal conception has enough to believe in, because there's no content to the idea. So that will undermine belief. And if you don't believe in it, then you can't be a theist.
So one of my favorite questions, and I have maybe some wild views here about Hume's dialogues. One of the big questions in dialogues is who speaks for Hume? So to give people some, like you said, that this was very dangerous to be writing at his time. And Hume was very, very sensitive to that. He had personally, he had seen people he had known be persecuted for having these sorts of beliefs.
Yeah, persecuted himself.
So he puts these three characters in dialogue, modeling very heavily off of Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. But he puts even more distance between him and the ideas by having it be retold by a student of Cleanthes, no less, to another kind of very minor character.
Yes.
So there's a lot of distance that Hume puts between him and his characters. So naturally the question is, who speaks for Hume?
Yeah.
So I'll leave that question to you for now, and then maybe bring out my wild hypothesis.
Okay, I'm interested to hear what you say. I mean, I have a fairly orthodox view in this, which is like, and it's been someone who wrote a lot about this was Norman Kemp Smith in his famous edition of the Dialogue, like I think 1948, and he defended the view that basically it's Philo who more or less, and I think that the qualification more or less, one has to be careful here because it's not just like he's speaking for Hume and that is Hume, because it's more complicated than that. Because for the reasons we were talking about earlier, Hume has Demia sometimes represent his views to criticize Cleanthes, and sometimes has Cleanthes to represent his criticisms of Demia, and he plays them off against one another. So there's a complicated kind of dance going on here with various characters presenting various arguments that Hume would endorse or be sympathetic with. But as a kind of general understanding, Philo so perfectly fits Hume's own character as a skeptic and represents systematically Hume's views in terms of a general philosophical orientation that I've always been staggered, to be frank, this is a bit kind of intolerant of me, but I've always been staggered that people would even spend a lot of time trying to explain. Now, there are some scholars who have claimed that Hume, in fact, is represented by people like Cleanthes. I toys with that. But I have to, without getting into all of the details of it, I find that, and you just gave a very good explanation for, apart from anything else, he wants to put a lot of distance between himself and these characters. I think if you want, for two reasons. One, I think genuine prudence, that he had to be super careful. Everybody involved had to be super careful. But also a little bit, if you want, for a better reason, if a more attractive reason, if you find being worried about prudence kind of a low motivation. I think it's just plain common sense. But I actually do think that one of the admirable features of Hume is that he is genuinely philosophically respectful of the people he's dealing with. So he wanted, and this goes all the way back to some of his letters to his friends very early on, he wants to give a fair chance to the theist view. So he doesn't want it just to be a one-sided facade of a conversation. He wants it to be a real dialogue and to represent all the parties fairly. But having said that, at the end of the day, yeah, I think Philo, it's very hard for me to believe that Philo doesn't represent the main line of Hume's position.
So I certainly agree with you. So I think that it is right to say that Philo mostly speaks for Hume. But so where my view gets a little wild is that I think that all the characters speak for Hume in certain points in Hume's life.
That's interesting.
So I don't think anything in the dialogue happens arbitrarily. I think every single thing that happens in the dialogues happens for a reason. And so Demia breaks off from the conversation. I think it's somewhere like part 11 or something. They're having this, and he gets frustrated and runs off. Hume expresses that he wants Cleanthes to be the hero of his story, and he wants as many arguments to get it up there. And really, at the end, the only one that he has is the one that we mentioned, that the cause or causes of order in the universe probably bear some remote analogy to human intelligence. Yeah. I think that Cleanthes was Hume's genuine attempt to try to use his science of human nature to arrive at something religiously significant. Yeah. Couldn't get there. I think he had tried originally as a Demia. He was this orthodox. He saw the rationalist philosophy and was like, nope, tossed that out. And you see that come out over the course of the discourse. But there's at one point in section 4, Pamphilus, breaks in and says, look, this irregular design argument is kind of given Philo a fit here. He seems a little embarrassed and he doesn't really know what to say.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think that that's Hume, maybe toying or putting distance. I think that was genuinely Hume. I think that was that irregular design argument was the one thing that he didn't have a response to, but it was also the only thing he could let his hero win with in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I am interested in what you say there, and resonates with me in some ways. There's actually a lot. I think there's a lot to be said about this, although a lot has already been said. Maybe some people would say too much, but for what it's worth, Ben, I have a view that's sort of related to yours and maybe sympathetic to yours about the whole idea that the dialogues represents Hume's struggle all the way back in his life. To say there's some kind of autobiography going on here, and I'm very sympathetic to it. I would slightly tweak it. I just put this to you just in case you're pursuing this, if I'm not being boring here, which is that when I have, maybe if you remember in the Riddle, I talk about this, that when Hume was young, I think it's an aspect of Hume's philosophical development that has been terribly neglected and is still terribly neglected. When he was young in the borders of Scotland, in the 1730s, there were very, very significant people right around him. Pamphilus, the narrator, stands to Cleanthes rather as Hume stood to Lord Kames or Henry Hume.
Yes.
And so there's a biography going on here, I believe, along the lines that you're suggesting, which is that this actually, I do believe, and I think this is, I'm quite sympathetic to the general hypothesis you've got here about the dialogues. There's a very important figure who, again, I think has been horribly neglected. In even, I admire many aspects of Moster's biography, but I think there's huge gaps in it, sadly, about this. Andrew Baxter was a very important Scottish philosopher. Kames and Baxter had a debate about Clarke's philosophy. All of this stuff has been neglected for a long time, I think, with the whole, British empiricist kind of stuff that's obscured so much.
The unhelpful divide.
That unhelpful divide.
That puts Malebranche and Berkeley on opposite sides somehow.
Yeah, there's all this kind of weird, exactly. So it mangles everything, and Spinoza and Clarke end up on the same side, the whole thing, so the short version of this would be something like Demian then would, I think, is remarkably close in many ways as a defender of the argument a priori to Baxter.
Wow. I'm going to go look this up now. This is a rabbit hole for me to chase.
Yeah, I know there are other people who have written a little bit about this, but it certainly jives with my stuff in the Riddle, and I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying is the long and the short of it with this, and it is quite important about Hume's fundamental philosophical development and formulation and about the dialogues itself.
But that would explain why he's so intimately familiar with all three of these views and knows exactly how to make all of these moves and maximize each of these moves.
Right.
It just seems to me like someone who's tried philosophies in three really important ways and was like, hey, why don't I take these three ways that I've thought and make them into three characters?
Yeah, and really have a kind of exchange, and that he struggled with this when he was young. It also explains the kind of interesting feature of the dialogues, which is that Pamphilus and Philo always speak very respectfully of Cleanthes, and Hume, had it sort of maybe at times got estranged from Lord Kames, but he was always treated him like a father figure and a very close family friend. So the respect for Cleanthes comes through and all the time.
Yeah, I think he genuinely wanted Cleanthes to be the hero because he wanted that project to succeed.
Yes.
And it didn't.
Yes. Yes, exactly. No, it's interesting.
Well, so we've gone about an hour and 20 minutes now. Professor Russell, thank you so much again for agreeing to come on and discuss Hume. This was absolutely an honor for me to be able to host this. We would love to have you on again sometime to discuss similar topics. Where can people in the audience go to find more of your work?
So I have a website. I should know my www. If you Google Paul Russell philosophy Lund, it'll show up. And my web, and it's there. I also at Philpapers.
We'll leave a link in the description.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much. And we'll flood my website. Get sudden activity. On Philpapers, if people are interested, I've got stuff there too for the philosophers who are out there. Yeah, and obviously I've got books. Most of my books are published with Oxford University Press. I've got books on Hume. The main one would be the Riddle of Hume's Treatise, if people are interested.
I very highly recommend that book. It definitely helped me through my journey through the treatise, because the treatise is very, very, very long.
It's a demanding work.
But it was certainly invaluable, and it's been several years since I've read it now, but all of this has been amping up to me rereading it again.
If you appreciate the content and the tone of what Relay Theology has to offer, you can show that appreciation by leaving a review on iTunes. You can also support us directly by making a small recurring donation to our Patreon. Comments, questions, criticisms, and requests can be sent in audio form to relaytheology@gmail.com for possible inclusion into future episodes. We want to thank our patrons: Bike Mearns, Charles Hoffer, Jason, Robin Willems, Ed Atkinson, Kim Bushkovsky, Jeff Rubinoff, and Brandon McCleary. Music is by Casserole, a Chicago-based band, and used with permission.